Lily Geismer is she's an historian. She is the author of Left Behind, which is a new book out right now. It's by Public Affairs Books. I have it in my hand right now, as you can see it. She is a professor of history at Claremont McKenna College, previous author of Don't Blame Us, Suburban Liberals, and the Transformation of the Democratic Party. This is a conversation I love to discuss, and I think so many of us love to discuss on the left. What better time than as we go into midterms and what people are saying is going to be another shellacking for the Democrats. Lily Geismer, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. And I should say I have a little bit of a cold, so if I sound a little distorted, that's the problem.
I am constantly losing my voice, as David knows. I'm always like, oh God, I'm losing my voice again because there's just so much talking in my life. I used to love talking.
I think it's from. I'll blame it on teaching.
Exactly. So, all right. The word is out. The Democrats are not what we all thought they were maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But I remember this, I can't remember if it was like an official rule for presidential historians or if it's just sort of something that historians talk about where, there should be a pause on official biographies of presidents of a couple of decades, partly because you start to see how their policies were enacted, how they played out. Is that something that I just heard through the grapevine, or is that true?
No, I think it's maybe it's an urban legend but I think there's often an idea of not looking to the recent past, and I think there's actually been like a sort of reticence to do that, and that was actually one of the things I wanted to do in this book, was that there wasn't a lot of real sort of critical discussion of the Democratic Party's history since the 1960s and 1970s. There's often a sort of story of it, the party pausing, and then it's sort of this story of decline. And actually, in both of my book projects, I've tried to understand the party more critically during that period. And especially one of the main goals I had was to sort of rethink this moment of the 1990s and the Bill Clinton era. So it's not a biography of Bill Clinton, but it's an understanding of kind of what the sort of context in which he came to power and the kinds of policies in which he enacted and what their impacts have been.
But it is interesting because it has been a couple of decades. When I right before I joined the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, I read a biography on Bill Clinton, and I think that's probably when I heard like it's a little too soon, but it was. You were just starting to really understand and feel the effects of everything from NAFTA to the crime bill. I mean, you saw it. It wasn't like we were blind, but people were starting to have conversations openly about, maybe his legacy wasn't all that great because, as someone who was in school in the 2000s in college, everyone always said, oh, if we could go back to the Clinton years, the economy was great. It wasn't that great. I mean, this is actually what I really love about it. It's less about party politics and more about the economic policies that his version of the Democratic Party presented and the promise that really wasn't that great.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things there. I mean, one, I think, and I similarly came of age in that moment, and that was actually one of the things I really wanted to do, was to understand the story that I had been told about the 1990s, and I think that. And thinking about its long-term impact. And I think so often, especially amongst Democrats and people on the left, there's a tendency to blame Republicans for everything. And it's not to say that they're not responsible for many things, but it's also to understand kind of what Democrats were doing during this period. And I think one thing that oftentimes there's so much focus on kind of on party politics and kind of elections, but what gets forgotten is that once people are elected, they enact policies, and what do those policies look like? So that's what I really wanted to sort of understand, was the particular policies, especially that the Democrats who it's Bill Clinton and the group that's known as the New Democrats, who sort of were concentrated around the Democratic Leadership Council. I was especially interested in their ideas about how to address the problems of poverty and inequality. And this issue, because so often the story of the 1990s is a story of economic prosperity, and that the country came in, left the 90s in a sort of moment of boom, and that's kind of the legacy of Bill Clinton. And while that was true for some groups, at the same time, there are many people who had quote unquote left behind in that process, and actually led to a position of being in a much more unstable and vulnerable position. by the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s. And I think we're living in that legacy very much today.
So before we get into this this boom, this much built on credit kind of boom, what was the Democratic Leadership Council for folks who may not know?
So it was a group, and it's an interesting. They were a group that held a lot of power, who now have kind of fallen out of the kind of conversation. But it was a group of primarily Democratic politicians who, in the aftermath of the 1984 election, which was this huge landslide loss of Walter Mondale against Ronald Reagan, had this idea that the Democratic Party needed to kind of reconfigure itself. And it was a group especially of members of Congress, many of whom were known at the time as the Atari Democrats. They were people who really believed in tech as a solution. I think that's the best name in politics that hasn't been used. And then also a lot of Southern moderate governors of states who believed the party needed to shift its priorities towards the center. And so they organized this group. And so Bill Clinton and Al Gore were both founding members of it. Their executive director was a man named Al Frum. He's still alive. I didn't mean to say that he was the organization.
He won't go away.
He's still around. They started this organization really with the idea of shifting the priorities of the Democratic Party. And I should say, I mean, they were around starting in 1985, early 1985 is when they were officially founded. But when they really gained power is in the aftermath of, is in the late 80s, early 90s, when Bill Clinton becomes their figurehead. And he becomes critical to the success of the Democratic Leadership Council, and they actually become really critical to his push for national power. So it's this combination. And one of their big things, I should say, is they really believed that one of the things the Democratic Party needed to do was to focus on the presidency, that for the Democrats to gain power, that meant focusing on winning presidential elections. And so I think that's actually shaped party policy in various different ways. Another critical part of their philosophy, of their strategy, was about that the party was too focused on trying to kind of win over marginalized groups, or especially what they were really focused on is they thought that the Democratic Party had become too beholden to special interest groups, meaning groups of color, women, and especially unions. So a big part of their strategy was to shift the kind of the traditionally tight relationship of the Democratic Party to unions and move towards other groups, and especially focus on moderate suburbanites, and also build ties with industry and other types of groups. So that's the kind of strategy part. And I don't want to go on too long. I can answer the other part, was that their philosophy was. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
How are they different from the New Dems, and how are they different from the Blue Dogs, who were a caucus in Congress? Are these sort of the same people?
It's the same groups as the New Democrats, and so in some ways they're not. The Blue Dogs are slightly different. In some ways that's much more about sort of tactical strategy. I mean, this is actually a sort of more philosophical. It is a philosophical ideology, but they define themselves as New Democrats, and so that's really part of their vision, that they're kind of reshaping who the Democratic Party is, and shifting in that direction. And so those terms sort of become synonymous with one another.
I remember reading. I can't remember where, but there was something sort of it was just sort of passively suggested that, around the time when the Democrats, the official Democratic Party, really purged unions from membership and replaced it with lobbyists because of quote unquote, you have to keep up with the Republicans in terms of funding. I also remember reading that the DLC took some Koch brother money. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I didn't come across that. They did get a lot of. They got money from Michael Steinhardt, so private equity money was critical to the founding of their public policy institute. I actually think one of the things I came to there, and so the interesting thing with the story of the DLC, and this gets where it gets a little bit weedsy, or inside baseball. Some of those ties come later, like in the 2000s, as they're kind of shifting their origins. So I actually found in the early days they were less kind of pro. It wasn't the sort of unabashedly pro business that sometimes they get associated with. In many of what the book looks at actually is what they tried to do is their philosophy, which was this idea of kind of using market and economic growth as a means to address kind of traditional liberal ideals. So they still believe, I mean, this is one of the core questions I had is like, why are these people Democrats? So like, what makes them still part of the Democratic Party? Like what's different than being a Republican? And I think that there's still a commitment to certain ideas of equality. They have unlike kind of the, so in some ways what I argue in the book is what they represent as kind of a democratic version of neoliberalism that's different than, distinctive from the kind of traditional story of neoliberalism of someone like Milton Friedman or Ronald Reagan, who believe in very limited government or no government. I mean, kind of letting the market the market for the sake of the market. And this is more of belief in there's still a role for government, and the government kind of is a catalyst to help the private sector do the work that was once done by government. So they still believe in sort of helping
public-private partnership.
Absolutely. So a huge part of their, yes, exactly. So it's a huge part of their vision is public-private partnerships, and kind of, and so one of the core founding principle, or what they turn into their kind of philosophy, is this idea of you expand opportunity, not government. So that's done through things like through market growth, public-private partnerships, and all of those kinds of mechanisms. And also bringing in market principles to make government more efficient. So it's a lot of these kinds of overlaps between government and the private sector, and sort of solidifying those relationships, but it's not the full Friedman version of sort of, ending government. I mean, I don't think like literally ending government, but sort of it's not like a libertarian view of like the market itself can sort of is all powerful and can do everything.
Well, what baffles me about this is, by the time Clinton takes power, and even by the time the DLC really materializes, the model of like, from what I understand, the model of PPP or, basically putting government on credit through bonds, et cetera, it was already failed. It failed in New York, Ford's famous line. And later on, as it continued, failed in Detroit, it failed in Buffalo, it failed in New Orleans, Puerto Rico famously, then Greece, Argentina. But they just kept going. They just kept saying, no, it's going to work this time. Am I missing something? It was like...
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, so that this, like, what is not acknowledged as kind of what's not working, and like what the limits of the private sector can do. And I think that there's, in this moment, I think there's someone like, who Clinton brings in first as his senior economic advisor, and then as Treasury Secretary is Robert Rubin, who's someone who has basically directly contributed to the kind of growth of Wall Street, of things like the bond market, and understanding that, and believes believes in those tools to address these other kinds of solutions. So I think there is this kind of firm faith in the powers of the market, without kind of a recognition of some of these other types of questions or failures that have come in. And there's an idea that you can kind of mitigate that too. I mean, I think that they're not going for it's not the Ford, you're on your own to New York. There is some way of like, we will help, we will sort of create the kind of middle ground area. And then the other part that's really critical, and the book looks at extensively, a lot of the program that one of the final programs that Clinton institutes, this idea of new markets, of sort of treating, of opening up and showing to private companies the power of that sort of poor communities are good investments. And so like that's the kind of public-private partnership too, of like bringing in new kinds of investment.
So let's get to that for a second, because I'm old enough to remember when the housing market collapsed. I was shocked the other day when I was on air with somebody, and they were talking about how they were 12 years old during Obama's first election. I was like, oh, okay. I
know. I since teaching college students, it's really, I've started to feel just really aged. The things that they don't do and don't remember blows my mind. But it's kind of incredible.
Like, that was a minute ago.
I was thinking that the financial crisis is something that they're like vaguely aware of, but have not. It wasn't.
We're still at it. Well, it's like when they go after millennials. Sorry, guys, if I'm offending half the audience here, but it's like when they go after millennials as being so out of touch. I'm like, we never even got our day in this. Like, what are you doing? We're still in it. Anyways, the housing collapse, way back in the day, and Lehman Brothers, of course, that is absolutely an effect of Clintonian policies, and during the 2016 election, it was brought up a lot with Elizabeth Warren because she challenged Hillary Clinton on some of these policies, explicitly, because Hillary was in the Senate at the time. So can you? And I don't want to confuse Hillary and Bill's policies either. It was just they kind of got brought up at the same time. But what went underway with HUD?
How did this happen? So, I mean, it's in some ways, like someone described this book as like you're watching like a slow moving crash as you end up into the housing crisis and the financial crisis. And I think that is this critical question of, and like, I will be clear, I don't think that was what they were like intending to happen. Like, it wasn't like, oh, we will do all this and then we'll have this huge housing crisis. Or fully understood at the time what was going on. But I think this goes to this question of what happens when you try to use the market in various different ways to do good and to solve problems. And the two key pieces that lead to that Clinton era policies contributed to that lead to the kind of financial and housing crisis have to do with a couple of things. I mean, one is the broader architecture or landscape that I was talking about of kind of trying to bring in corporations to kind of do the work of government. One thing that does is opens poor people up to and low-income people up to predation in various different ways, but also with the idea at the bigger level, the idea of kind of that the private sector can replace the welfare state, which is a lot what was going on, so that you replace them. And the famous one is welfare to work, that you can replace what was traditionally, you can, instead of having support, you can have jobs or entrepreneurial programs or various different other things like that. That left people in a much, much more vulnerable position. So those are like the groundwork for it, but the actual policies with HUD are two different programs. One, Clinton opened up a program of the National Homeownership Strategy, which was a big idea that like homeownership was down, but that there's all this kind of power in getting people to own homes, and so established a program to encourage more home ownership amongst groups that had been sort of traditionally left out of the housing market for a variety of different reasons. And so this is, in some ways like sort of going after. And so it's almost reverse redlining in various different ways. But at the same time that was going on, I mean, in this kind of big program to kind of help people purchase homes and make that more available and sort of ease the processes through which, and that sort of bureaucratic red tape that could happen. There was all of these critical changes to the sort of basic financial infrastructure through deregulation, and the critical piece of that is the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, the going into and then in the various different things with credit derivatives, some of which Clinton has walked back after to understand what happened, but this sort of reshaped the economic landscape such that it enabled the kind of in many ways lay the groundwork for what happens a decade later. And I will say it's not just, I don't think that the Clinton administration is like the solely to blame for the financial crisis and the mortgage crisis. I think that the subsequent policies only sort of fully exacerbated it and remove some of the other kinds of programs that Democrats had put into place. But I do think it is critical for understanding some of the basic infrastructure that did lead it to happen. And because of the fact that under the Clinton, during the Clinton era, so many of the kind of basic systems of traditional welfare were really taken away, or the social safety net. It left people in like a far more vulnerable position when the financial crisis happened. And so that also leads to things like the combination of things like also the promotion of globalization, NAFTA. Like there's a variety of different factors that kind of took away some of that critical social safety net. And I really do think the last, now it's more than a decade, but the last 14 years have been very much sort of seeing that part play out in I guess, a fast-moving train crash.
It's interesting. So folks who watch my show know that I've been doing a documentary on Puerto Rico, and I'm reading a book right now. And just today, I was reading this one part where there was a tax incentive law that had been on the island for 40 years at that point in the 90s, and it was 2 years after NAFTA was passed that Bill Clinton repealed, because it comes from the federal level, repealed the tax law, but he was very reluctant to do so. And this is a left writer, I was very surprised to read that he was reluctant to do so. because, and let me be clear, that tax law was good because it provided jobs. So what happens now is people just go there, they don't pay taxes, and they don't have to do anything. They're just literally like, it's like a fire sale on the island. But he repealed it for many reasons. And in the book, it kind of went through the conversations that were happening internally, that it's now been, released. I say this because I wonder, I mean, you say some of this was not necessarily the intention, but some of it, I also know Harold Hickey's political beliefs to this day. I mean, it's very confusing to me how, in some ways, it doesn't seem like it may have been a solution. Okay, like let's take this on good faith. Like their solution to deregulation of Reagan-era policy, like their complete, goal to eliminate the government, Reagan's crew. I mean, they always talk about incrementalism, but at the end of the day, okay, if this is about incrementalism, then why would you be so obsessed with debt? Why would you be so obsessed with this concept of like, we can't have a safety net? I mean, you can look to Europe and say, we can do both things. We can still believe in the private market and have a social safety net, because that's how most of modern day Europe operates. I don't understand where the good faith is and where the political philosophy is.
Yeah, and I think, this is a core question. So I think in some ways, like one of the things I really wanted to argue, and in many ways the book is written to this like understandings of, to give a kind of more nuanced view to some degree, because I think there's a really easy way the very cynical way is like, this was all just strategy, and this was strategy to win elections, and also to preserve power, to give power to particular kinds of groups. I think there was some strategy in it. So it's not to say that it wasn't like they were operating within this like frictionless world where there wasn't like a very powerful Republican Party who was increasingly gaining power, and they were having to operate and understand that process. But I think there was also this way, and so this goes to the question of like, because in some ways you could say like the outcome is still the financial crisis. The outcome is still Puerto Rico being in a extraordinarily difficult position. But I think like to the point, I don't know the exact policy, but from looking at what Bill Clinton what I understand of his philosophy was the idea that like by repealing the taxes, that would bring more business, which would be good for the people of Puerto Rico.
Right.
So instead of
he
sort
was
of thinking
with
that,
it.
He struggled probably, yeah. I mean, I think
that's what I was really shocked by. I thought his philosophy would have been like, go for it, take the island.
No, and I think there is this constant thing of like, what is good for, I think he did genuinely believe in trying to help people in various different ways. So it wasn't just like, we're going to like come in, it's going to be a bonanza for private corporations and, and this is going to be sort of where the Democratic Party is. I think there was still a belief that like, what is best for people, like, that's the part that sort of maintains the traditional aspects of the Democratic Party and liberalism to it, but thinking about those in a new way. And I think the intent is really important to understand, because it actually, like, in sort of thinking about good intentions, like that can obscure actually the harms that it does, and understanding that oftentimes things that have certain types of intentions like actually do have serious harm, especially because these become reproduced all the time. And I think things like tax breaks are a critical one. I mean, the number of different, like every president has tried a certain version of things like opportunity zones or empowerment zones, and they have
Puerto Rico.
Yes, exactly,
like
absolutely. And so that's like, these are ones that sort of ricochet too, because they're tried abroad, they're tried at home, and they just have like routinely not worked. But there's still a faith in that idea, and so I think that's the thing that I really want to understand and make other people understand, like what was the thinking behind this, and why is there such a sort of commitment to it. And I do think the Democratic Party has changed. I mean, I don't think the Biden administration has the same kind of like blind faith. They've understood some of these policies are not doing what they were supposed to do.
Right.
So that is like a sort of way. But I think that there's always the sort of, this is always there. And there's always the sort of questions of sort of when the Democratic Party adopts this kind of thinking.
There's so much to this book. I mean, I would love to have you back on to discuss more, everything from charter schools, because that's a very big part of the Democratic Party's, pull away from teachers union, largest union workforce, largest public sector workforce. And now we see our next guest is going to talk about this, how the Republican Party is using every opportunity to go after teachers, which is a much bigger story, to, the basically the predatory nature of these policies, and what happens when you get in bed with credit companies and big banks, and and obviously long-term effect. But this is an incredible, really, it's very well done. Very well done. I highly recommend people check it out. Love to have you back on if you're open to it.
I would be delighted to. Thank you so much. It was incredibly interesting, and I look forward to your documentary on Puerto Rico too, because I think it's such a critical topic. So
2 years from now when it comes out.
Well, I will have my eyes up, but I would be happy to come back anytime. And thank you
so
for engaging and talking with me about the book.
Go check out Left Behind, the Democrats' failed attempt to solve inequality. I think we all know that by now. Lily Geismer, it is out. Go check it out wherever you buy your books. It is from Public Affairs Books. Go check it out now. It's a great read. Great, great, great. All right, we will be right back after this break. I don't know if you know, but we are on all of the podcast platforms. David figured it out. I didn't really know that we weren't on all of them, but thank goodness we have a great team that understands these things, because I just read the news like crazy and then talk about it. That's pretty much my role. But if you are really into our show and you are able to do so, please join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. That's what keeps the show going.